Well, now that we've heard these wonderful CMU faculty colleagues sharing quite a variety of perspectives on generative AI in their courses, let's discuss how all this ties into policy. So actually, why don't I invite all of our panelists to come up here to the seats, and we'll have a chance. Why don't I ask one question to each of our policy experts so that we can all hear from them, and I'll introduce them as we go. Greetings. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, and there should be mics at the chairs. Great. And I will start with Matt D'Amelio, Director of the University Contracts Office in the Office of the General Counsel. So, Matt, at the far end there, hello.
Hello.
Can you tell us what generative AI tools, if any, are licensed and vetted through CMU?
We have it probably at this point in time. There's almost a dozen that we've vetted. Most of them that have come through, we've approved. I can tell you the one I haven't approved is called Solve Intelligence. Solveintelligence.com is one of the greatest scams I ever saw. It's really cool. What it does is it says, let AI write your patent. And then what you do is it says, give us your technology, and you pump this technology in, and then it supposedly writes your patent. Of course, it doesn't say that any of your information is confidential, so I think it's really great. And then when you look at the people who founded it, it's really interesting, their backgrounds and who they've worked for. So don't use Solve Intelligence. I'm not saying that a faculty member here was the one who asked for it, but yeah, that's the one that I have not approved. But we haven't looked at Watson yet. And we have not looked at, so we've reviewed ChatGPT, we reviewed the Bard, we're looking at another one for Google, and then just about the other one. The only other one that I found that was, and this came out of ETC, was it's Midjourney. Midjourney is different than all the other ones. If you go to ChatGPT and read the terms of use, basically what most of the AI says is that your input is yours, your output is yours, and the content is yours, and there's some issues beyond that. But what Midjourney says is, your input is yours and we own everything else, and we'll license it back to you, which is really interesting, right? Because the question becomes is, can you really license it back, considering that the US Copyright Office has indicated that AI is not copyrightable, so therefore you really can't have a license. So Midjourney is a little bit sketchy. I would be careful. And we have not approved that. We've approved that for sort of capstone courses who are looking at it, but that's the advice. Sorry it took so long.
No, thank you. That's very helpful, very informative. Why don't I go next to Dan Munch, Assistant General Counsel, Office of the General Counsel. Dan, as a CMU instructor, can I require students to use generative AI tools to do work in my course? And are there certain types of work that my students can or cannot use generative AI for? Could you speak to that?
Sure. I'll start with the typical lawyer answer is that it depends. Like any tool, AI and the legality of how, whether the way you use it is legal depends on how you're using it. My pen, I can use it to write something that is lawful speech. I can use it to write something that is illegal defamation. And it depends on how I use that tool is whether it's legal. Can you require a student to use AI in a course? Under certain circumstances, yes. There are some concerns, however. The use must be compliant with FERPA. None of the AI tools that I'm aware of are FERPA compliant at this time, which means that no student identifiable information can be put into the tool. Now, when does something become covered by FERPA? It becomes covered when the university collects it for purposes of grading. Now that means that you could potentially have a student on their own, in their own way, using their own personal account, create something with AI, do an assignment with AI. Once it gets turned in, it cannot, once the university collects a copy, it cannot be stored in an AI tool in a personally identifiable way. Because that is personally identifiable student information that is contained now in a product, in a tool that is not FERPA compliant. You've shared personally identifiable student information with ChatGPT. ChatGPT is not a school official. They have not entered into a contract with the university to be a school official, and therefore you have violated FERPA if you share if the university provides student personally identifiable information, and that includes names, images, voices, recordings, anything that's personally identifiable with one of these tools. And that's not just with AI. It would include, let's say, before we had a contract with Box. Currently Box it has accepted our terms. They are considered a school official, but in the old days they were not. And if you uploaded something to Box when we didn't have FERPA contract with them, that would have been a FERPA violation as well. So in that respect, the AI tool is not any different. I will also add, we don't necessarily have a policy on this, but as a general practice, we should not force students to be required to sign up to use the terms of a product if they don't want to do it. Like, we're compelling them to use a third-party product which has certain terms and conditions. And I'd be careful about compelling students to do that. So I would encourage, if you're going to have an assignment where AI is required, that there be a strong pedagogical reason why you want to use that particular tool, or maybe you offer that they can use select from multiple different tools. Just say, you have to use one of these tools, here's 5 you can use, you can pick, and make it clear that they sign up with their own personal accounts. And then I think, to add to Matt's point, would also caution folks that in order to have a copyright, you do need to have human authorship, and students may not actually own the output that is generated through AI. It sort of gets down to what level of, again, in what way are you using AI? Are you using it just to grammar check or supplement your own original expression, or is ChatGPT or another service totally generating sort of with a somewhat unpredictable or at least not specifically predictable outcome in mind?
Got it. Well, thank you. It is rather nuanced, and so you can see why we brought the experts to share their knowledge with you all. Now, last but not least, another expert, I'm pleased to introduce Lenny Chan, Associate Dean of Student Affairs and Director of the Office of Community Standards and Integrity. So, Lenny, I have maybe 2 questions for you. One, has the university's academic integrity policy changed in response to generative AI tools? Why or why not, depending on your answer?
Thanks, Marcia. This was a question that came up very early and comes up very often related to generative AI. The simple answer is no. We did not have to make any changes to our current academic integrity policy. When we looked at our policy, violations fall into one of 3 areas: cheating, plagiarism, or unauthorized assistance. Unauthorized assistance basically means you can only use resources that are authorized by the course instructor. Therefore, unless the course instructor authorizes the use of ChatGPT, then it would be a violation of the policy to do so.
Thank you. And that reminds us, cycling back to Haley sharing her policy, and it's very important for each of us to be very explicit about when it is and isn't appropriate, so students will know what would be authorized assistance. My follow-up question might be on people's minds. What has been the impact on academic integrity violations in the past couple semesters? Could you say a few words?
Yeah, so like what the timeline was said earlier, but we really didn't see much of ChatGPT in the fall. It kind of came up around midterms of the spring 23 semester, where we started to get some violations related to ChatGPT and other generative AI. It's a good question, and I'm not a lawyer, but maybe it's to steal from Dan's, like, it depends. But I think that there's challenges around detecting generative AI, and those are, and like Professor Massaro referenced earlier, while there's tools to detect it, there's also a lot of concerns about the accuracy of those tools. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to detecting use of generative AI, and I think that's an issue that's going to continue to be evolving each day, and one that faculty need to be thinking about. I really like the examples of how you can set up learning in your classroom that can either allow it to enhance it, or it would be kind of a barrier for students to use it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So that was a lot of very useful policy information. For the next few minutes, I just want to return to our faculty panelists, and then we will have Q&A from the full audience. And I'll go in the same order as our presenters. First, for Haley, the policy you shared discourages some uses of generative AI, but you talked about not wanting to have to use a detection tool, as Lenny just talked about. This suggests you really need to trust your students that they're complying with the policy you set out. Can you talk more about how you developed that trust?
I mean, it's still in development. I'll put it that way. I do have to relinquish some control, that's for sure. I've tried using the AI detection tools on the market myself. For instance, I've used ChatGPT myself to just generate content and then run a detection tool on it to see how accurate it is. Most students are smart enough that they know that if they change a few words around here and there in the content that's been generated, then it's going to be more challenging for that tool to be accurate. And in the tests that have been conducted in the field, not just by me, have had kind of like a mixed bag of accuracy when it comes to has a student used generative AI, or did they generate this content on their own. And to be honest, trying to go through the tools, go through the granularity of all of their content and determine, was this generated by AI in part or in full, and it was very, very time consuming. So trying to retool my policy a little bit around embracing generative AI and being more clear about uses that are appropriate versus not appropriate, I think has, one, opened up some time and bandwidth for me, because I'm not constantly policing every single word on the page. And with the activity that I introduced, fact checking it, like back in the spring when I started noticing students were using this, and I would go through their sources, and then I found out this isn't a real source. This paper was never written. That takes a lot of work. Students weren't necessarily super aware that that was an issue with the technology, and then going through and fact checking some of the stuff that they've seen, I think has, anecdotally at least, helped to show them that this is an imperfect tool. It has its place, and that's not generating an entire assignment or piece of content for your courses.
Great, thank you, Haley. Let's turn to you, Danny. You talked about how you use ChatGPT to assist your own teaching as a partner to you and an assistant. I was wondering, and you gave us a little teaser that you also used it in more student-facing ways. Could you share a tidbit on that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a new assignment that I've created where I ask students to respond to a prompt about some opinion issue in the class, and then I ask them to give it to GPT and ask GPT, or it doesn't have to be GPT, it can be Bard, it can be any AI, but ask it to criticize the argument and give the strongest counter-arguments that it can. And the students are actually evaluated on how effectively the AI they use can criticize, how strong the criticisms are. And part of this is teaching them to use better prompt engineering to create better outcomes. And then I ask the students to go through and rebut what the criticisms were. So they have to engage with the difficult criticisms and then come up with counter-arguments to them. And it's, we've only had one assignment that has gone through like this, but it's been sort of remarkable watching the students, first of all, have to grapple with how hard it is to get GPT to give the criticisms that they want to see, knowing that they're going to be evaluated on that, and really learn how to use GPT better, which they're going to have to do in the real world. And secondly, to see how interesting it is that they do engage with these difficult challenges, and they do engage with the criticisms. And again, I have 160 students in the class I use this on. I wouldn't be able to go through and give the kind of critical feedback that GPT is giving about, here are flaws with your arguments, here are nuances that you're missing, etc. Not all of the arguments that GPT gives are good, but those are just easy for them to rebut. The arguments that are good, though, force them to really criticize, and just looking at their rebuttals to GPT, you can tell they really are engaging with this at a very deep level, which is the main purpose of this assignment. So I found it very useful for that, and I hope that it will both just get them used to thinking critically about their own arguments, but also getting used to using these tools in an effective manner for when they move on.
Thank you. So what I want to highlight in that is that you're also being very explicit about you want students to focus on the quality of the argument and the strength of the critique and rebuttal, which gives me a segue to one thing that I noticed in Ray Lynn's assignment, was that it also was part of your adjustment of the assignment to really focus the students on being creative and using a novel medium, for example, and really pushing themselves maybe into something outside of a traditional format. So I'm wondering, how did you assess or define this creativity for your students? Was it somehow in the way you laid out the assignment or rubric or something perhaps?
Creativity is hard to define. The three methods that I used were really just sort of, was it alternative? Did they tell a good story? And did they use just like different kinds of medium, which is really kind of tangible. And you could make the point that maybe people did that, but it still wasn't creative. I think for this class, it was one of my smaller classes, and I was grading all the papers, so I could get a feel of like, even some of the students did things that were just like blog posts, but they wrote them in a very creative, fun way, which was a little different than like you would get like standard essay that was like, I did this, then I did this, then I did this. But it was kind of more fun and reflective. I think the test for me will be, as we're learning with all of these, I have now implemented this in my larger course, Euchre, of 100 students, and I have TAs who then grade the papers. So will that sort of hold up, and how do we define creativity across 6 TAs grading papers? But I really think it's the definition really kind of comes in the difference between, is it sort of just the regular type of repeating back or repetition, or is it something that is just going to be a little bit more fun and engaging? And I hate to say this, but we all know as people what is more engaging and what is a boring essay to read. I know that's not necessarily fair, but given that it's 10% of the whole assignment, right? It's not like I'm grading the whole assignment on the level of creativity.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to all our panelists in indulging me in these questions. Now it's your turn. So what I'd like you to do is, we'll spend just a few minutes maybe talking at your tables about the questions on your minds, having heard all of these interesting comments and presentations. Think about what you want to ask the panelists, share it with someone at your table, and be sure to go to that URL, or you can access it by the QR code and enter in your questions, so then in just a few minutes, I'll begin drawing from them and posing them to our panelists. So why don't you all take a few moments and chat amongst yourselves to consider what questions you want to ask our panelists. Okay, I'm going to bring folks together for our group Q&A. Anyone at the light switch want to flip the lights? All right, we're going to get back into it. If you are finishing up at your tables and you have a question you want to type in, please do so. I know that one of our panelists has to leave early, so I'll start with a question for Danny. You addressed looking through negatively coded responses, finding false negatives, but how should we think about the false positives? At what rate do these occur, and how do we know or decide how much time to spend reviewing or testing the output of AI tools?
Well, I just assume that any positive sentiment is not a false alarm.
Fair.
So that's a no. I mean, actually, it's a tricky question. So I get samples of both positive and negative things given to me. So I can see if there are obvious false alarms that are common, but of course the whole point is to be sampling. And so it is possible that there are things slipping through, and I'm not checking on those. I will say that you can use a variety of more advanced tools than I am currently using to explore particular questions that it will spit back to you answers on. But I think one of the things about GPT is it makes mistakes. I mean, so do humans. But GPT will make mistakes, and this is not a perfect tool for solving all of our problems. I would not say replace talking to students and looking for other forms of feedback with this. But I will say that it has, because I've always gotten exit tickets, and now I get so much more out of them. As long as I'm willing to double check and look and spot check and things on but just basic things like, so I had one of the questions I always ask in my exit ticket is there something we should know or something we could improve? And there was a student who wrote, no, thank you for the lecture. But they forgot the comma. So what it said was, no, thank you for the lecture. And so that's the sort of thing that they can make mistakes on. But of course, I also could make a mistake on that because I am interpreting the no, thank you for, no, what it actually says was no, thank you for the lecture. And I'm interpreting that there was probably meant to be a comma there because a normal person wouldn't have said that. Even if they didn't like the lecture, they might have said it a little differently. So there's always interpretational issues. GPT makes different mistakes than humans do. And if anything, seeing the differences may make you rethink certain things.
Great, thank you so much. Another question is an interesting one that I think may be a little more toward our policy experts, but I'm kind of curious if anyone on the panel would like to speak to this question. Is it okay to require my students to pay assign them to sign up for one of the paid generative AI tools as part of their coursework? So I'm going to look over at the far side first, but I'm interested in anyone's opinion on this. Maybe it's like
All right.
analogous to a
So-
textbook.
Well, yeah, so there's a lot of stuff there, right? So you got to unpack a whole bunch of things, right? So one is it like a textbook? Is that something that you would normally do, right? The second is, if you buy a textbook, depending upon where you buy it, depends on how much information you give. But the problem is, like with ChatGPT, the privacy policy of ChatGPT only provides privacy policy towards the information that you give. So the information that you give, in order to create the account, the question then becomes is, and I'm going to push this back to Dan at this point. The question is, if you say to someone you have to have the account and you have to open it up, and we've gone to ChatGPT 100 times, that's an exaggeration, but enough where we know we're running a wall, to get them to agree to hold that information as a school official because it's directory information, right? And so at that point in time, the question becomes is that sort of, where does that fall into saying you have to use this, and oh, by the way, you have to give your directory information to this third party, which the university doesn't have an agreement with. And so that's the issue that has to be resolved. And that's the hard one. And so...
Yeah, and then I think it gets into sort of like, to the textbook analogy, what's the pedagogical use? So if the course is about the use of this tool, let's say it's a C++ course. You obviously need C++ to do it, or you need the program. Well, if the course is about X tool, how you use it, you're going to need to purchase X tool. So there's a stronger case for doing that. But there's also other considerations too, like, is it ADA compliant? Is it accessible to individuals with disabilities? What private information is going to be shared with it? We mentioned the FERPA issue. That basically means that the instructor can't view any content on that platform because the platform is not FERPA accessible. Everything that is submitted for grading needs to be removed from the platform that is not FERPA compliant, submitted via a FERPA compliant method, and that could just be a printout if necessary, and graded in that format. So it makes it, I think, a bit cumbersome to do those things, but in theory, you could compel the use of that tool. I think that would be akin to saying, I want you to go put out, like maybe it's a journalism class or it's an advertising class, and say, I want you to create a classified ad and go get it published in the local paper. Okay, there's a fee for that maybe. Well, yeah, you have to pay that fee. It's just akin to maybe purchasing a textbook, things like that. So in theory, if there's a pedagogical reason to use that particular tool, and it's a strong one, I think you could require a student to purchase a particular third-party tool to use in the course.
I hear you. And one thing I resonate with there is something the Everly Center always emphasizes is matching the tool to the learning need. But I want to push back on maybe this piece about the paying. Like, how much should we expect our students to pay this extra piece here, this extra piece there? And I'm curious if anyone else wants to speak to that on the panel in terms of maybe it's an extra $20 fee that students would have to pay in order to equitably participate in the course.
Well, again, I think that would go to how does that compare with other expenses that you have in the course in terms of books, supplies, and so on. I know some books are, at least in my time, back when we used physical copies of books, could be well in excess of $100 for a single book. That was 25 years ago. Sure. So I don't know, maybe $20 is not an unreasonable price for an AI tool.
Understood.
Just
thing
one other
yes,
comment,
please.
Marcia. The other thing is that I think that the natural question that precedes that is the university doing anything? And the question is, yes, ChatGPT basically came forth about 4 weeks ago and said that they would entertain an enterprise-wide agreement. And so we've reached out to them, and the response that we've gotten back from them is, everybody wants an enterprise agreement, we'll get to you.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the problems that has always been the communication back to them. But we're trying to solve that.
That's a good point. I think if I could, as a moderator, also contribute as a panelist here, one of the things that I often think about in course design is what are the costs, the actual monetary costs that students have to contribute to be successful and to be on a level playing field in the course. And so even if other courses or traditional textbooks cost a lot, I think being mindful of these costs that students must pay and the equity issues there is important for everyone. Now I have a question that might be a little more for our faculty panelists. What are your goals as an instructor in the age of generative AI? What are the skills you're most focused on supporting your students to learn? Thank you, Danny, of course. Thanks for your contribution. Thank you.
Yeah. So another class I teach is design of AI products and services. So as in human-computer interaction, we also want to teach them that, and I've heard this a lot, it's not just a tool, but it's kind of a material to design with. And I think a lot of our goals are really to, sitting here and listening today, there's a lot of talk about words, or we think about AI and generative AI like people, or that it thinks, or that it makes up things, or that it gets things wrong, and it's not really thinking at all. And I think that's the most important thing we can teach, is that it's really just going out and looking at patterns and saying, like, this looks like the most reasonable common pattern, and I'm going to come back and put this out. And there's a term out there called, like, AIs hallucinate. And this is from my colleague, John Zimmerman, who's really, like, more of an expert in this area. But he's like, it's always hallucinating. It's just whether we agree with it or not. And I think that's the most important thing, is that students think that this is an official answer coming back, that the computer knows what this is, and that it knows that it's right, but it is actually just a pattern that it recognizes and it's bringing back, and it may or may not be real, it may or may not be data. So I think our goals, and I heard this a lot with the other two faculties, teaching people how to use it, teaching people how to recognize that it doesn't have the answers.
Yeah, and being critical thinkers, I'm hearing in your message. Do you want to add to that, Haley?
I can add to that. 100% agree. It's about understanding the capabilities of this tool and its limitations as well. And I think that when it first emerged onto the scene, there was a lot of uncertainty, not just in the students that I teach, but in myself as well. Posing questions, putting inputs, getting certain outputs, and then trying to check those responses to see how accurate they in fact were, and then understanding, one, how to craft better prompts to get better outputs, and also understanding the limitations and the appropriate use of tools like these. As a writing instructor especially, this has very large implications for me and other individuals that would pursue careers in writing. And so I'm looking to think about and explore how we can use this as a tool to enhance our writing overall.
Right, thank you. So we're not losing that craft and skill development as well. I have a specific question for Lenny, and then I have a couple for the full panel. So Lenny, this sort of ties into the plagiarism piece, I think, a little bit that you talked about, but more generally, in terms of the field, where do we as an education community stand on the ethics and integrity challenges that use of such derivative tools raise by default? How can we encourage citing references when the tool itself uses so much content that has already been created, and many times that these sources cannot be traced? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about unless the course instructor authorizes, it's unauthorized, which if it's an unauthorized resource, students are going to be unlikely to cite it as being something that they have used.
So if I might follow up on that first, how are there ways you've heard of how faculty or instructors might document their use of generative AI in an assignment, either Lenny that you've heard or anyone else to contribute on that?
Yeah, I think I'll just say just kind of what was mentioned is that if you do allow use of generative AI, to make sure that the student properly cites that if it's in a paper, or I know sometimes with assignments, when you turn in an assignment, you have to list all the people or resources that you've used for that, so you should definitely have it listed there if it was authorized.
Great. And Dan, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, and I've heard of examples where instructors have allowed certain uses of generative AI, but they require disclosure of the use, in some cases disclosure of the exact prompt that was used, of the tool that was used, and perhaps even your own description of the way in which it was used. So if you're going to use it to edit for grammar and spelling, you just say, I used it to, and you disclosed that ChatGPT was used for this purpose. Or if you used it for something, if it's permitted, you used it in some more robust way, that you provide the prompt for which it was used. So just, I think, disclosure of the use when it's permitted is I think it should be cited like any other tool that you might use, any other permitted tool that you might use. But yeah, to Lenny's point, when it's not an authorized use, I don't think you're ever going to get to a point where someone's going to voluntarily disclose that they use something that is prohibited.
Please.
And just to follow up on that, if you're really not sure what to do, buried in the terms of ChatGPT, they give you a sample what to write and how you used it. So it's actually on their website. So if you want to find it, it's there. If you need it, send me an email, I'll send it to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this question sort of taps into larger ethical issues and ethical considerations that are just sort of inherent to this technology. And a couple of the questions tie into that. One is, what are the implications both for learning and legally of AI tools generating misinformation and potentially replicating biases that we have? Similarly, I think there was a question about, so I'll focus on that, I guess, the ethics that came in this other question about how we're not citing the sources that the generative AI models used to learn. So are there thoughts that you have about these big considerations?
Yeah, I can maybe start with that on sort of the ethics and particularly how the law applies. As I said before, AI is a tool. The existing legal principles will apply to it like they apply to any new tool that emerges. AI is subject to civil rights law, to defamation law, to university policies, to ADA compliance, to deceptive trade practices regulations, to copyright law, or in some cases to not copyright law, but it's old principles of copyright law that they are applying. When the Copyright Office ruled that AI-generated content is not subject to copyright, they cited cases finding that it was one of the cases cited was actually one where a painting was created by a chimpanzee, and the owner of the chimpanzee was trying to argue, this is my work, and the court said no, it was created by an animal, and the copyright law says that authors must be human. It said that for 100, 200 years. So they're using existing legal principles, some of them very old legal principles, and just applying them to a new tool. So when you talk about biases inherent in the tool, yeah, I think there is a problem that ChatGPT sort of reflects sometimes inaccurate or biased majority type reviews because it's pulling from the input that's put in from the tools on which it has I forget the term what it has been trained on, and there may be inherent biases in those sources that it's been trained on, and if an AI tool spits out some content that is biased or discriminatory or fraudulent, there are legal implications to that, just as there would be if a human did it or if another company did it. In some cases, I think where there may be one difference where we're going to see emerging law or application of existing law, rather, under Section 230 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, internet service providers are normally immune from liability for content posted by users. So when I go on YouTube and I post content that is discriminatory or defamatory or infringing on copyright, I'm liable for that, but YouTube is not. When ChatGPT goes out and does it, that's not necessarily my expression. That's OpenAI's expression. That's them talking. They're probably not eligible for the Section 230 immunity because it's their tool generating the content. It's not their user doing it, it's them doing it. And they are very likely liable for that. And so when ChatGPT, there's actually a case, I think, that was filed against them in North Carolina, where it generated a news article that was fake, but talked about a real person with their real details, but then fabricated that they were involved in some sort of sexual scandal.
Yeah.
And the person's now suing ChatGPT for defamation.
Right.
So this is a problem, and I think it's a problem that users of ChatGPT need to be aware of, because existing law will apply, and the users of ChatGPT and or the owner of ChatGPT are going to be held responsible for the content that spits out to the extent that it violates existing law.
Yeah, what this highlights to me, and it harkens a little bit back to Haley's earlier presentation, is our students may not be aware of these limitations and problems with the tools. And so just as Haley, in your assignment, you encourage students to do the fact checking, to make them, take the responsibility for the output. I think it may also be something that part of your role, our role as educators, is to help students understand that the tools may produce output that's not only faulty, but also is biased and discriminatory and has other problems with it. So they need to be held responsible to address that in their use. So thank you for that. Any other comments on that question?
I'll throw my 2 cents in. And I sort of, it's interesting because I have said publicly at different presentations on AI on this campus, I said, you either think it's the most wonderful thing in the world that could ever happen at one end of the continuum, and at the other end of the continuum, it's the beginning of Terminator. And so someplace in there is where you're at. And I think that the caution, and I'm going to echo what Dan says here, the caution is that we as attorneys don't have, the law doesn't change until this stuff happens, right? So we basically have to look at what's going on based upon past law. You also have to look at who the judges are on the benches, right? These are mostly people that are not native learners with regard to computers, right? So they haven't seen technology. This is something new to them. So just know when you go to the courtroom, you're not going to see somebody who maybe went to Carnegie Mellon and was in HCII. You're going to see somebody like me, who's my age, right, who is a political science major, and say, I don't understand what you're talking about. But I think that, I think it's important to understand that I went to a webinar one time, a legal webinar, where somebody said, if you thought the last presidential election was bad, wait for this one. Because it's not just ChatGPT, it's all of those other AI forms that take your voice, take your image, create your stuff. It's the stuff that SAG-AFTRA are fighting with basically the generation of content through AI that Dan and I, like, you could take what we say today and, like, somebody will just, you put a different script to my voice now you have a different outcome to the answer to the question. So I think that's the real issue, and I think it's important, sort of from a classroom technique, to say, look, there's a real ethical issue here, and this ethical issue hasn't changed from what teaching's been for 1,000 years, right? You're always looking at that. And like Dan says, all of the same laws apply to these that didn't apply 6 months ago. And we saw, when the faculty was talking about the increase in what they saw, we saw it at the contracts office at the same time. Mid-spring semester, it was like whoosh, everything went up and said, can we use this, can we use this, can we use this? And we're like, whoa, this is interesting. So that's where ethically I think it is it sort of goes back to, you know, when you're in, you know, what does that do? You know, where do you learn your ethics from over the course of your lifetime? I think that's where it
Maybe
applies.
last comment from Dan, and then Lenny, did you?
Yeah, I just want to add to something that Matt was saying too about when these go to court, it's not going to be the computer science experts. They're ruling on whether AI is lawful. And this, I actually saw a speech from the Federal Trade Commission, the secretary of the Federal Trade Commission, talking about AI, reminding people that the law is often looking at what a reasonable person who is the impacted party, who is the victim of some sort of fraud or deception, it looks at their perception of it. So it's when AI is used for a nefarious way, it's not going to be, you know, the complex computer science description about why AI generated this outcome. It's going to be, no, this was the impact on a reasonable person who knows nothing about computer science. There's also a concept in tort law known as the eggshell plaintiff, meaning that if your victim of whatever has happened is particularly vulnerable to that, that doesn't matter. That if you're in a car accident and the victim has some condition that makes their bones brittle, that doesn't mean that the person who caused the car accident isn't responsible for the extra damages that were suffered. So for AI, you know, the people who are victimized by it, that's going to be what the courts and what the law system is looking at. And it won't necessarily matter if there's some complex explanation for how AI got to this result, or, you know, the designers of it didn't really intend that it would do this or that. The fact that it does it will be how it's judged.
Yeah, I'll just say, pulling it out of the legal landscape and even the ethical one, you know, my conversation with students after they have an academic integrity violation is, at the end of the day, it's not about the grade you earn in the course, but it's about your learning. And when you use a tool like ChatGPT, you might have gotten a B on the assignment, but did you actually learn anything? And how will that impact you today, tomorrow, and down the road in your career and your life? So just always bringing it back to the student learning piece.
And that is an excellent note on which to end it. Let me just thank our panelists and thank you all for this great session. If you want to continue the conversation about generative AI in education, please go into the program. There are some Eberly activities you can join in later this semester. Thanks again.